the Mishcon Academy Digital Sessions.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this Mishcon Academy session, part of a series of online events, videos and podcasts looking at the biggest issues faced by businesses and individuals today. I'm Jo Lonergan, a trainee in the commercial litigation team, and I'll be hosting today's event. Some housekeeping bits before we get started. If you're joining us online, you've joined automatically on mute and without video. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and I'll pick it up. If you have any tech issues during the event, let us know via the chat and one of the Mishcon team will give you a hand. Okay, so today we're joined by Mary Beard, one of the country's most well-known historians and author of over 20 books, including the bestsellers SPQR and Women and Power, available here for those of you in the room today. We'll be discussing Mary's most recent book, Emperor of Rome, also available here today, which unpacks the fact and fiction of Roman emperors from Julius Caesar's dictatorship in 48 BCE to Alexander Severus' assassination in 235 BCE. And just a note to say that Mary has kindly agreed to sign books after the talk, if you want to stick around for that. Okay, so Mary, I'd like to start with your approach to writing the book. You flip the story of Commodus strutting around the Colosseum, menacingly waving the head of an ostrich at the senators. You flip that on his head, and you wonder, if I can just quote your own book to you, what it must have felt like to be on your own in the middle of the amphitheatre, out of place, pathetically waving an ostrich head at the ranks of senators who were all munching their laurel leaves and barely concealing the fact they're all laughing at you. So when many of us associate the Roman emperor with power, tyranny, and license, why was it so important to you to insert a more human element in your book?
It's a very good week to be asking that, because I'm sure we all know how many men think about the Roman Empire, however many times.
I was going to ask you about that,
And I'd like to say that it was all invented by my publicist, but actually it was just entirely coincidental. And I think for them, the Roman Empire and the figure of the emperor is really about power. It's a kind of, if you say, why do people think about the emperor or the empire in that way? I think it's because it's a safe space to be macho. It's 2,000 years ago, so it doesn't matter very much. But the image, the fantasy, is about these kind of all-powerful blokes. And I suppose what I wanted to do was to prick that bubble a bit. I should say, absolutely 100%, I despise one-man rule, autocracy. I don't have any sympathy for the emperor as a political institution. But I thought almost no one ever sees it the other way round. And there is this famous anecdote that you mentioned that classicists love, that there's Commodus, he's in the amphitheatre, and he's had some spoof encounters, just like in the movie Gladiator. He's had some sort of spoof encounters where he always wins with other gladiators, and then they kind of tie up some animals for him to kill, so it wasn't exactly very difficult or very brave. He then decapitates this dead ostrich. I mean, it's a horrible thought. And he goes to the senators who always sit on the front row, and he waves the head at them, and he takes his sword in the other hand, and he grins. We have an eyewitness account of this, and goes like that, as if to say, "You next," But the eyewitness account is very kind of wry, because, as you say, the guy writing this, Cassius Dio, a historian who was there, says, I ought to have been scared, but actually I just wanted to giggle, But I thought, actually, if I was caught giggling, this is just like, being in a school classroom, age 7, and you can't giggle at the teacher, but so you bite on your ruler. He said, so I didn't know how to stop myself. So they're all in their dinner jackets, the ancient equivalent of dinner jackets when they're in the Colosseum, in proper toga, and he's got laurel wreath on his head, and he gets a leaf out of the laurel wreath and bites on it very hard, so kind of to disguise the fact, and to kind of hurt himself a bit, so that biting a lip, so that he didn't get found out. And everybody loves that story, because they think, oh gosh, we're all on Dio's side. He's sitting there wanting to laugh. We know what it feels like wanting to laugh, and you're not supposed to. It's kind of one of the few occasions in the whole of kind of antique culture where you sort of know exactly what that felt like. On many occasions, you don't quite know what it feels like to be there, but that experience of knowing that you shouldn't laugh is one that everybody shares. And I just thought, come on, guys. What was it like to be Commodus? Look, I think history is at its best, she says, I don't mean that boastfully. It's at its best when it tries to kind of flip things and see them a different way. And Commodus isn't an idiot. I mean, he's got written up largely after his death as a monster, and that's what you see in the movie Gladiator. But he's got himself in this position where he's in the Colosseum. It's a very kind of edgy space, not just because slaughter is happening, but the emperor, in a sense, is parading himself to his people in the Colosseum, and they're all watching the spectacle of slaughter beneath. And it's a kind of big dividing line between what it is to be a proper Roman and what it is to be excluded, and the mark of exclusion is down there on the floor of the Colosseum. And it produces a problem for lots of emperors, that they think, they're not looking at me. If you're emperor, you have to be looked at. You're in the Colosseum, and you're kind of presiding. You've given these games, but everybody is watching the spectacle. And so the temptation to jump the arena boundary and make yourself star of that show is very, very high. And you think, Commodus already knows that, that it never works out. That never, ever works out. And then he kind of gets, drawn, if this story, and probably is true, to kind of go over and sort of taunt the senators a bit. But in the kind of course of doing that, he makes himself look an idiot. He knows he looks an idiot. I mean, how could you not know you look an idiot? Only if you have this kind of extraordinary view of Roman emperors, which is that they were over-the-top display artists who didn't have a moment of self-reflection. And that, it seems to me, for me, that moment is when you see the double bind of being an emperor. You're an ordinary guy. You're not very special. And you have to believe in yourself as ruling the Roman world. Now, I imagine that's not all that different for prime ministers or presidents or whatever. How do you believe in yourself as a figure of power? And so I found myself wanting all the time to think, not that as I said, not that I think that the system they were trying to uphold and did uphold was any good, but just a kind of personal level. What on earth was it like?
It's interesting. It's also good to know that you don't want Emperor Rishi.
No, I don't. I do not want. Absolutely not. But I suppose my kind of thought about this goes quite a long way back, really, because I remember when Lady Di was still alive, Princess Diana. I remember reading an account of what she did in the morning. I mean, it's probably in the Daily Mail or something, wasn't it? And the account said that she'd get up, she'd go downstairs, she'd go to the newspapers, which had all been laid out on the table, and she'd look for photographs of herself. And my first instinct was to think, how vain, haven't you got something better to do than just go through looking for photographs of yourself? Then I thought, it must be more complicated than that. And she was in a bit of a position of that kind of, she was a bit above Rishi in terms of, popular recognition. And I thought, she has got to learn, she's using those photographs to believe in herself as Lady Di. You know, that she's actually an ordinary, probably not terribly, well, certainly not very academically bright young woman in a crap marriage, but she's got to learn that she is the image that she wants to be or she is made to be. And I think the emperors are doing that. And I think all these guys are doing that.
Yeah, if you don't believe it yourself, how can you expect other people to believe it? Yeah, no, interesting.
It's very interesting, sorry, I shouldn't
please.
let you go. But there's many of the most elaborate, most high quality statues of emperors are found in imperial residences, which I think is another part of it. You know, that they're not actually put up in the forum so that, you know, we can all kind of kowtow to them. Some certainly are, but not all of them. The number, there's an extraordinary number, are found in properties we know to be owned by the emperor, as if somehow you need the image of yourself as emperor, just like Di, to believe in yourself as emperor.
You can gaze upon yourself.
Yeah.
To go back to something you said about commodus having a bit of a bad rep post-death, I thought it was interesting that you seek to do a bit of myth busting in your book, but you do also indulge a few of the myths, so that the book opens actually with Elagabus and his habit of releasing tame lions, leopards and bears amongst his hungover guests after a big party, which I'm sure they appreciated, and then smothering his guests with rose petals. There's a picture of that actually in the book, in the first page of the palette. It's amazing. But so, since you indulge these myths, what do you think they can actually tell us about the Roman emperor?
I think that you have to transcend the idea and the question of whether they're true or not, right? I mean, by and large, the stories that we hear and read and have become absolutely kind of part of the image of different emperors, by and large, those are told, we don't know when they originated, but they're told and written down after the death of the emperor concerned. And so the Roman Empire is an absolutely extreme example of history written by the victors. So Caligula would be a good case. You know, Claudius replaces the Emperor Caligula after Caligula's assassination. The justification, in a sense, for the assassination is that the PR team goes into overdrive and says Caligula was absolutely awful. And so the assassination was a good thing. Thank God we've got the Emperor Claudius. You know, it's not very complicated PR. The difficulty is now that we can't know whether, you know, good people and bad people are assassinated. Right? Everybody in Rome who is assassinated, with the possible exception of Julius Caesar, was written up to be bad. Some of them might have been, some of them probably weren't. Some of the ones that get a great reputation were probably just as seedy and nasty, but they happened to be succeeded on the throne by someone who was investing in them. So the first really good emperor is Vespasian, 100 years into imperial rule. And why is he a good emperor? Well, he was succeeded, the first time it had happened, he was succeeded by his eldest son. Yeah? So Titus's reputation depends on Vespasian. Vespasian becomes good. When Caligula is assassinated, what we need to blacken him. So, and yet we can't tell. You know, I think I'm very suspicious of a kind of one strand in Roman history, which is to find a villain and to spend 500 pages of a book proving they were really good, right? That sort of revisionist history, it may be true, it may not be, but I don't think, we can't tell. So what I try to think about, because I don't want to throw away the anecdotes, these kind of colourful anecdotes are what makes the Roman Empire terribly appealing. You know, what did Domitian do in his spare time? He got out his stylus and he killed flies with it, you know, that kind of stuff. You know, what did Tiberius do in the swimming pool?
What did he do in the swimming pool?
Well, I'll tell you, it's really awful. He had what he called his little fishes, who were young boys who came and nibbled his private parts. Yes. Right. Okay. Now we do not want to throw these. I mean, they're a very boring bit of ancient history. If all we said is I'm not interested in those, I think what we have to say is, what are they telling us? Because these stories, true or not, they're told against a context in which they make sense, right? And they're told for a purpose. And I think your story about, when you mentioned about Elagabalus, who, sorry, I'm going to...
don't worry.
Every time, you don't have to bother about whether you get the names said right, because we don't know how Elagabalus said it either, right? Okay. You know, there are wonderful stories, like the one that Al-Muqaddimah depicts in the 1880s. Guests go to dinner, and it's a trick that many emperors pulled. You know, how do you show your generosity? Well, eventually you shower the guests with rose petals. The only trouble was that Elagabalus was too generous, and there were so many rose petals that they smothered and died. Right? It was murder. Right? Murder by rose petal, and I hope you look at the picture of that Al-Muqaddimah depicted that, which is in the book. And it's a wonderful picture, because if you look very carefully at the faces of the guests, you can see that some of them are still blissfully unaware that this is going to end badly, and some of them are already feeling a bit scared. So Al-Muqaddimah, you know, I thought, captured it. But the usual way of seeing that story is to say, oh, he's only a teenager. He is assassinated age 18. He's on the throne for 4 years, 14 to 18. Say, look, this is the kind of thing a capricious teenager on the throne does. You know, he just kind of makes a mess of it. And that's partly what the story is about, I think. But it's also reaching to, I think, rather more important issues about how people reflected on Roman emperors and their power. It's partly saying, I think, when an emperor is generous, it can kill you. You know, emperors kill with kindness. That the emperor's generosity can be as dangerous to you as the emperor's threats and violence. And so, in a funny way, I kind of find it, you know, a rather sophisticated little vignette of how the emperor might operate. Why is the emperor dangerous? How do you feel, you're invited to dinner? Is that a scary, opportunity, or is it the best invitation you've ever had in your life? Well, of course, it's both.
Yeah, life or death sometimes, it seems.
Yeah, it's the imperial banquet, I should say, and you'll find more about this in the book, is the kind of, in ancient Rome, is a classic crime scene. It's a bit like the English country house or Cluedo. Professor Plum with the lead piping in the library, so the idea that death happens at dinner, that murder is always on the menu, is a way that people thought about how the emperor operated. And you go to dinner with the emperor, and you're surrounded by his food tasters who are tasting for poison. And a sensible precaution, you might say, on the part of the emperor, but is also one that reminds every guest that there might be death happening here. As soon as you've got a food taster, or there's a wonderful epitaph in the book of the chief food taster, or whatever, as soon as you've got that, you're telling people the poison. This could be poison here.
Could be your last bite.
Could be your last bite. And I'll tell you one more anecdote, and you
Go
go on.
No.
And it's all about, and the court is all about sort of suspicion. The great tale was that one of the Emperor Tiberius's renegade female relatives comes to dinner. He's trying to be nice to her, even though they've really quarrelled. And he says, oh, do have an apple, right? She puts her hand into the fruit bowl, and just for a minute, she hesitates. She just thinks, But then she thinks, I've got to eat this, so she does. Tiberius notices that moment of hesitation, which gives away the fact that she suspects him of trying to poison her. And she's soon in exile, and then worse.
Yeah, that was an interesting part of the book, actually, the section about women and how, everything from their sexuality to their influence is just seen as a massive danger under one-man rule. Yet, in another way, they also have this newfound position at the forefront of the empire. So I was wondering if you could just talk a bit more about that and what the role was there for women.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that's easy to forget is that one of the biggest changes that you'd have seen from the old sort of democratic system in Rome to the new system after Julius Caesar of one-man rule is that you saw images of women in public. That if you'd walked through Rome in 75 BC, you'd have seen goddesses, and you might have seen a couple of mythical Republican early heroines of Rome. Otherwise, it's blokes only. If you go to 75 CE and you walked through Rome, the public space displays women. The wives, the sisters, the daughters, and the mothers of emperors. So the imperial family and that kind of dynastic, an investment in dynasty, that changes the visibility of women in the public sphere completely dramatically. And I think it would have been one of the biggest things. No one ever mentions this, but that would have been one of the biggest changes you'd have seen.
Definitely.
I think that you then got the problem of the image of the illegitimate use of power by women. And that fits, I think, quite easily to another of the changes that happened with the Roman one-man rule. I mean, the old systems of the Senate and consuls and all that, they continue, but everybody is well aware that the real power is behind the closed walls of the palace. And behind the closed walls of the palace, people who have power are the people who are close to the emperor. And that's a major kind of social hierarchical upheaval. It means that some slaves, the emperor's slave barber, who has 20 minutes with him in the morning and can whisper in his ear, becomes a potentially powerful figure. And the women, even more so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned that we should ask Carrie Johnson some of the...
Exactly, because
you've got
the Carrie Johnson phenomenon, because we know that the same would have gone for Sherry Blair or went for Nancy Reagan. The women who were associated with modern political leaders are also believed to, and probably do have, influence over the political leader. But they also are a kind of absolute lightning rod for misogyny. How do we explain the fact that President X made that stupid decision? Blame the wife, right? And we saw that very obviously with Johnson and the animals coming out of wherever it was, and so in a kind of broadly misogynistic world, the women are useful. They're useful people to blame, and they're useful explanatory tools when you don't really know what's going on. So in I don't know how many of you re-looked at or looked at for the first time the BBC's I, Claudius when it was recently reshown. That is a classic case. Robert Graves, partly borrowed from ancient writers. Livia and Augustus, the first proper imperial pair, they have a terrible trouble with their succession. They don't have a son between them together. Augustus has got a daughter and Livia's got a son from previous marriages. And what is clear is that a large number of those chosen by Augustus to succeed him die, right? Now, why do they die? Well, I mean, I think one of the problems in the ancient world is it's very hard to tell poisoning from appendicitis, actually, and it's quite easy a conspiracy theory is always better than a cock-up for most Roman historians, right? And so you're looking to explain why he had such bad luck with these successors. And Livia is the convenient answer. You can't disprove. We still can't disprove. The possibility she might have poisoned every single one of them, especially as in the end it was her son who came.
Answers range from once a day every time I go to the loo, or when I drive a straight road or something like that. It's interesting. And I'm sure it's a Monty Python or like a Joaquin Phoenix-esque emperor, but still interesting.
We always imagine ourselves at the top. When we think about the Roman Empire, we never imagine ourselves ordinary, right?
No.
We always imagine ourselves strutting around a palace.
No, exactly. Ostrich head in hand.
Yeah, exactly.
But in a recent Guardian article that I read while I was looking you up, you compare the fabrication of the Roman emperors to Rishi Sunak pretending to fill up an employee's car in Sainsbury's for a photo op, which it's a great photo, you'll see. He looks so uncomfortable.
It's amazing.
And at the very end of your book, you mention how the research has opened your eyes to the Roman Empire and that way of ruling, but also how it's opened your eyes to the modern political world. So it kind of got me thinking, how much of the then can we see in the now?
I think one always has to be careful about drawing too close and direct links. I mean, when Trump was president, the commonest question I got asked was, which Roman emperor is Mr. Trump most like, right? And
which Roman emperor is Mr. Trump most like?
Well, I tell you what I used to say. It depended how much time I had.
Okay.
If I had a lot of time, I'd say, now, let's sit down and think through that question, and actually, probably not like any. Yeah. If I was busy, I would always say Elagabalus. Oh. Because I knew they wouldn't have heard of him. Yeah, and at the very least, they just said, that you spell that with a, and
Elagabus.
That's right. And then they were going to go and look him up. They'd have to look him up.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry I interrupted you.
No, so I don't think there's kind of that sort of direct comparison helps. However, I think that I did come to think, and it's what I wrote in The Guardian, which is that what you see is that Roman critics, Roman historians, when you kind of pull away at the anecdotes, one of their problems is the emperor just an actor? Right? So why all that stuff about being so anxious about someone like Nero performing on stage? Well, partly because it's kind of pulling the veil away and saying the emperor actually is just an actor. And it goes back to the last words, which were very revealing, they're always made up, but they're revealing nonetheless, of several emperors, and Augustus himself is supposed to have said, as he was dying after 40 years on the throne, "If I have played my part in this comedy well, give me applause." So right at the very beginning, there is this kind of sense that what the emperor is doing is performing. And whether that's dangerous, is it just a performer? Should an emperor necessarily perform because that's what emperors do? Or does it show that there's nothing more there than kind of somebody else's words that he is mouthing? And it is our problem, you know, whether the people in power are actors is one that we face all the time. And that, you know, that Rishi Sunak photograph with filling up the car that wasn't his just sort of undermines everything that he was wanting to say. It's a bit like when whichever Miliband it was ate a hamburger or something, and it was totally clear he'd never eaten one in his life.
That's
right?
another great photo.
You know, and so we wonder about the sense in which can you really believe what you see when you look at people in power? Mm-hmm. And do they say when they say things, are they speaking? Now, Romans, even before the empire, had worried about the idea that the orator might be speaking somebody else's words. Mm-hmm. And Nero was the first Roman emperor who, when he gave the funeral oration of his adopted father, Claudius, who his mum had murdered, he had somebody else ghost the script. And Tacitus, the historian, says he was the first emperor to speak with borrowed words. Borrowed words. Now, we actually are very naive about borrowed words. You know, we see an article by the Prime Minister in the Sunday papers, and we imagine he wrote it. I mean, it says, you know, Rishi Sunak at the bottom. I mean, you know, when we sit and think about it, we know he might have kind of signed it off very briefly, you know, but he didn't write it. I mean, we know that the speeches of politicians are not written by them because we've got biographies of speechwriters. You know, we know who Thatcher's speechwriters were. We can sometimes, if you look at the recordings of Thatcher, you can see she didn't understand what she was saying. You know, when she says the lady's not for turning, I don't think she knows that it's a pun on the lady's not for burning. Doesn't look as if she knows that. And yet we fudge that from day to day. You know, we get a letter from the king, and you know it's signed by the king. We can't imagine he wrote it. Of course he didn't. You know, we're very stupid. But so there is a sort of way in which we live with that. But we also, when it goes too far, like Rishi and the petrol, we think that, you know, he's conning us. You know, that's not his car. You know, and he's taken off the Prada shoes, you know, and all the rest. And that was exactly what happened in the complaints about Roman emperors. Nero in particular, but not only.
Yeah, no, it's similar. It's like you share an anecdote about a wax figure of the dead Trajan, if I pronounced that wrong.
Trajan, yeah.
Trajan,
yes.
Being paraded around to celebrate victories which were already being overturned by the conquestors.
Are they just a model?
Are they just, yeah.
You know, Trajan has done a very quick kind of smash and grab raid on Mesopotamia in order to get some military glory. It lasts about 6 months, but he claims to have got a new province. He then dies. Hadrian takes over. There's a big problem, isn't there? You know, how are we going to celebrate these victories, which are not victories really, because we've already given the territory up, and the conqueror's dead. So what do? They make a wax model of Trajan, and they process him through the streets.
Party has to go on.
Party has to go on, and the reverse of that would be people like Caligula and Domitian, who there's a lot of pretend victories goes on in the Roman Empire. I mean, when you see all those statues of emperors in their battle skirts, that's partly a substitute for fighting, not a commemoration of it. You know, they dress up in military kit. Well, it's like our royals, don't they? They always get hundreds of medals. You know, actually, they've not served in an active combat ever, right? But they still got all these medals because they're wanting to say, I have a military basis to my power. And that the same was very true of Roman emperors. And they'd sometimes kind of get a campaign together, but it's sort of never, it always fizzled out. But then you want to celebrate a triumph, again, for another non-existent, a triumphal procession through the streets of Rome for a non-existent campaign. So what do you do? Because you're supposed to process your captives through the streets when you have a triumphal procession. But you haven't got any captives because you didn't really have a war. So Caligula and Domitian get told off because, in the historical accounts, because what they both sort of were supposed to have done a bit of conquering in Germany, but they didn't have any captives. So they get some Gauls and they dye their hair and they dress them up in Roman costume and they teach them a bit of German and they act out being the captives. Domitian even goes so far, it is said, that he thought, God, I've got to have some booty as well. You know, so no captives, no booty. So he goes to the palace furniture store and brings some stuff out of the palace furniture store to process through the streets. Now, it is actually wonderfully funny, right? And, you know, the idea that the Romans, you know, kept a straight face at this is a bit odd. But it also, a bit like the Elagabalus and the rose petal story, it's actually asking you to think about pretense, you know, authenticity. You know, is the emperor really a conqueror? And what if it is all a charade? You know, and I think it's not for nothing that the favourite Christmas game of our own royal family is charades. You know, I think it's about knowing, and you know, they're kind of recognising.
Yeah, well,
but it's all play acting.
We'll leave that one to hang in the air. And take some questions. There's none that have come in online. I hope I've done that right and I'm not ignoring anyone. But anyone in the room have a question?
Oh, I've come a long way.
Tane.
Hi, Mary. Thanks for coming.
Hi.
Oh, yeah. So I was just thinking about a lot of these anecdotes which have kept in the public consciousness about the Roman Empire and about emperors, specifically about Commodus in the amphitheatre and Domitian stabbing flies. It feels like history sometimes focuses on the personal depravities of emperors rather than their general administrative capabilities. Do you think that's a feature of history generally, that what we focus on is people's personalities?
I fear it is. And I think that, you know, I'd like to do both. I mean, I don't think we can reach the personalities of emperors, but I think we can reach what people say about the personalities of emperors. And I think there is a kind of sense in which, let's say, the details of administrative history or economic history have sort of been kind of pushed to one side, certainly in writing for a general audience, because they're thought to be boring, right? They're thought that, you know, what's exciting? Well, it's the stories of the psychopaths and all the rest. Now, if the Roman Empire had been ruled by as many psychopaths as it's supposed to have been ruled by, it would not have survived. You know, they can't be that. But I think one of the things I try to do in the book is to say, look, you can bring out the exciting, even from, God help us, Roman law codes, right? You know?
This is the right crowd for that.
Is the right crowd, yes, I thought, you know. And there's an awful lot of material there which somehow gets kind of just pushed into the seminar room. You know, it's kind of things that, well, you know, specialists in Roman law are interested in this. You you read all the stuff in the digest, and okay, some of it is extraordinarily boring. I would accept that, but you get into seeing what the emperor actually does, or at least what he puts his name to. And there are stories of power, exploitation, personal tragedy that are as vivid as anything you get by concentrating on the personality of the emperor. And I've tried to, as it were, bring back, out of the terribly dusty library corners, some of those things. I mean, economics, I think, one of the things that we forget is that the emperor was hugely rich, and that he was personally the owner of vast tracts of the empire. And you can tell that because we got papyri from Roman Egypt, among other places, which actually make that very clear. And he's renting out, or his agents are renting out his agricultural land. And I think it's, I suppose I talked about Domitian and his stylist, didn't I? I think that one of the things it'd be nice to do is to, as I think the Romans did, see the emperor not only in the swimming pool, not only in the murderous dinner parties, but also, what's his brand? It's a pen. The empire is ruled by writing, right? It communicates by writing, it is ruled by writing, and the emperor is a writer. And that, say, it isn't as sexy as a swimming pool. It looks a bit more boring, but that is getting you to the heart. And anybody who's interested in law knows that. That writing is a control mechanism as well as a liberation. And lots of stories are about emperors with their pens. What Julius Caesar is assassinated, what does he defend himself with? Hopelessly, as it turns out, his pen. Domitian uses his pen to skewer flies. But actually, that's what they've got with them. Hadrian gets cross with a slave, and he stabs at the slave's eye with his pen, blinding him. He feels very bad about it a couple of hours later and says to the slave, "Look, how can I make up for this? What would you like? Tell me anything you'd like." The slave just says, "My eye back, please."
Cheeky. We've got a question online from Nick Payne. He asks, how did the emperors project their image/power across such a large empire?
They're the first people to really do mass branding. Now, Julius Caesar is the first living Roman to put his head on coins. Now, that's partly about parading an image and connecting, I think, money and Caesar. But it's also getting his head into every pocket where Roman coinage is used. And we now don't think twice about it. That tradition has never gone away, that the ruler's head is on the coinage. I can tell you, in 44 BC, it was hugely controversial. And it looks like it's one of the things that prompted the assassination. But you've also got the flooding of the Roman world with the images of emperors. The emperor can't be everywhere. Some of them travel a bit, but there'll be millions. Roman Empire's 50 million people, probably. There'll be millions of people who've never seen the emperor in real life. But it is the first time that statues and paintings, although the paintings don't survive, are mass-produced. One estimate for Augustus, who's the first proper emperor, Julius Caesar started this, but he was killed too quickly to be able to do very much about it. The rough estimate, and it's very rough, for the number of statues of Augustus in the Roman Empire, leaving aside coins, cameos, paintings, marble and bronze statues, is between 25 and 50,000. And that's another way in which the empire, the institution of one-man rule, simply changed the way the world looked, right? And I think that's something that's very difficult to capture. And we now go to museums, and I watch people in museums and statues of Roman emperors, and I tell you, they don't look at them, right? I don't look at them often either. We kind of walk by the emperor, and go on. In antiquity, those statues were revolutionary. The idea that the ruler was represented by his marble image was, there'd been some statues of Alexander the Great, but he didn't last that long either. The successors of Alexander the Great did occasionally have their portraits on coins, not entirely clear. You've now just got the omnipresence, and it looks like it looks like a dictatorship. One of our images of a dictatorship is that you go down the highway, and there's a picture of the dictator on every other lamppost. It's that feeling that you get.
Yeah.
Interestingly, also Augustus, if you want the comparison with North Korea, for example, Augustus is an entirely made-up name. He was Julius Caesar's great nephew, fought a very bloody civil war, wanted a branding change, had been called Octavius or Octavian, and he thinks like, I'm going to need a new name. And he chooses Augustus. And we kind of now think of this as absolutely normal. It's the kind of name of the first emperor. It's what gives us the month of August. It was named after him. What it means is absolutely, literally, revered one. It's absolutely what we take the piss out of when it comes to somewhere like North Korea, and yet it's lasted as a quite serious title for 2,000 years. Yeah. Revered one.
Revered one. I like the sound of that. Any other questions in the room, Leah?
Hi, thank you, Mary.
Hi.
One of the things that's so fascinating about the Roman Empire is that even though it was such a long time ago, we seem to know so much about it.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Romans thought like us and that we can ever really understand what they were thinking?
I think that I'm glad you started the first with what you said first, because there is a tendency for people, particularly ancient historians, to say, there's so much we don't know about the Romans. We haven't got the perspective of the women, no writing by women, don't have much perspective of the slaves or whatever. But we have an enormous amount of stuff. It is terribly, terribly well documented. And some bits of Roman history are as well documented as what you get again in the West, first of all with Renaissance Florence in terms of the amount of documentation. The big question is always, well, are they like us or are they not like us? And the answer always has to be, well, in some ways yes, in some ways no. I mean, if they weren't like us at all, they would be extremely uninteresting. If they were just utterly foreign and remote with no overlap with anything that we do, we wouldn't be concerned with them. There's always been a bit of a tendency, I think, to make them too much like us and to, in a sense, project our own motivations or anxieties onto them. And I think that one example, one kind of model I use to think about it, because I think it's quite hard to know where you stand on that, is to kind of think about doing ancient history as if it was you were balancing on a tightrope. You're walking along this tightrope, and there's a sort of a different world is underneath you. And you look down on one side, and it all looks ever so familiar. There's people going to the loo, having kids, making jokes, playing around. You think, I can recognise that world. And you look down on the other side, and it's completely alien. And it's the same land, but it can look either familiar or utterly unfamiliar. And I suppose I think that's what's interesting about it. You know, that you have to constantly work out where you think you stand, and whether you think they were like us, or whether you're just fudging it. You know, it'd be so much nicer if they were. You know, I can understand what it was like to be this child in this place. Although almost all the ways they thought about the world were completely different, you know. They imagined a woman's body as having, you know, nothing between the mouth and the vagina. It was a tube, you know. So I can tell you how you can cure a sore throat. You know.
Not actual medical
It gives
advice.
us wonderful, you know. And you think, well, what would it be like if I did think that? Well, how different would my world be? So, totally right question and no right answer.
I think it'd be quite an uncomfortable world by the sounds of it.
Puppy dog fumigations is the answer.
Yikes. I reckon we've got time for one more question in the room and one more question online. So does there anyone have a question in the room? Yes. Oh wait, there's a microphone. Oh.
Can we just fit in two and one online? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I've made an.
Yeah. One there, and then online.
You mentioned that you're not a fan of autocracy, and I'm not advocating for it, but I was wondering to what extent you think the Roman Empire was so successful because of the institution of empire, or to what extent you believe that it succeeded despite that, and from the moment of the fall of the Republic, it was kind of doomed to fail.
That's putting me on the spot, isn't it? Because I think what is so striking about the Roman Empire is it lasts. As a system, it's fantastically resilient. I mean, in the East, it lasted the 15th century. We always think that the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century. Well, it did in the West, but it lasted till the 15th. And you have it's a really paradoxical position that the system is terribly resilient, and emperors are killed left, right, and centre, and the opponents of individual emperors get many of them. I find it very hard. I mean, in part, I suppose I'm going to say that however Augustus, who really much more than Julius Caesar, actually formed the system, and we've got no idea whether it was a master plan or improvisation or whatever, he did such crucial things which gave it longevity. And the prime one was nationalisation of the army. And if you look back to the Republic, you've got basically private armies fighting it out, including those actually owned by Augustus himself before he was Augustus. The nationalisation of the army completely revolutionised how force was used in the Roman world. And it monopolised force for the centre. In a sense, in that way, it was a military dictatorship, actually, that Augustus and the emperors controlled violence at enormous expense, absolutely enormous expense. Augustus, for example, started a fixed term of service for soldiers with a pension scheme. It was phenomenally expensive. It was so expensive that he was soon in our position and having to kind of lengthen the terms of service and put the pension payments off. But it was the central plank of stopping the fracture of emperor. And until 235, there's only two periods where, one in 68, 69, and the other in 192, where it looks vulnerable. And that is extraordinary. And even after the 3rd century, when things get pretty dicey, it can be restored again. There's a model for the restoration by Diocletian and then Constantine. But it is puzzling, was it despite it all? I don't know.
Thank you. And then we had a question just down the front here, and then we'll take the last one from online.
Hi.
Hi. Assuming that sort of Roman emperors are, they're sort of linked, they've got a religious role that they play as well at the centre of the state. Is there any sort of evidence of how do you prepare to be an emperor, number one, and how do you prepare to be a living god? Because it's not really a manual, is it?
Look, you guys are asking really good questions, every single question, because those are absolutely homing in on two of the really, really difficult transition points. We have no clue how emperors were trained to be emperors. We have Marcus Aurelius, much more interesting than his rather kind of overrated meditations. We have letters between him and his tutor, Fronto, still surviving. And, you know, Fronto gives him a little bit of good practical advice, like, you know, don't play with your mobile phone when you're supposed to be watching the races, because he'd taken in his correspondence to do in the Circus Maximus, and it did not go down well. It's a bit like, you know, William being caught texting during the cup final. And so, there's a bit of kind of savvy advice, but otherwise he is going through the kind of education we think it looks stultifying that elite Roman kids went through, you know, making up spoof speeches, you know, defend Romulus on the charge of murdering Remus, you know, etc. And we can only assume that they learned it on the job, and we can only assume that some of the people who are very important in that were the slaves and ex-slaves who are actually managing the show. So that's one big mystery. The other big mystery is what does it feel like to become a god, or to think you're going to become a god? You know, they joked about that. You know, when Vespasian dies, you know, he says, "Oh my goodness me, I think I'm becoming a god," right? Which was presumably a joke, not an observation. And you can do, and I talk about this in the book a bit, you can say, look, the boundary between God and man is much more fluid in the ancient world. That, you know, there's plenty of gods like Hercules who had started out life as mortals. So that transition is possible. It is still very hard to know how they thought about one day the emperor being a bit sick, then dying, and the next time having a temple and a load of priests. And Seneca, Nero's tutor, takes the piss out of that when he does a little skit about Claudius going up to heaven. And Claudius, you know, not the most kind of sprightly emperor, goes up to heaven, and the gods think, I don't really fancy you here, thank you very much. And they send him back down to hell. So they're puzzling about it too, I'd say.
Interesting, yeah. All I can say is that I hope I can summon some wit on my deathbed.
It's always invented afterwards, you know, so you don't have to.
I'll
somebody else will summon the wit for you.
So online, quite a nice one to finish with. Someone has a good reference here. Taking the Python view of what did the Romans ever do for us, which emperor left the biggest legacy and why?
I think this is a really boring answer to a nice question. It has to be Augustus. Not only because we still live with Augustus, we live with Julius Caesar and Augustus in July and August. They named the months after themselves, and we still use it. But I think that there is no other place, there's one possible other place, where you can see the world changing in a way that lasted for centuries, except under Augustus. I suppose, you know, my second place, I'd say the Emperor Caracalla, not a very nice piece of work. Murdered his brother on his mother's knee. But in 212, he made every free person in the Roman Empire a Roman citizen, giving millions and millions of people citizenship. It probably counts as the biggest grant of citizenship to huge numbers of people ever in the history of the world. I mean, and it changes the balance between the insiders and the outsiders. It makes everybody an insider. They find other ways of making insiders soon, but essentially it has made everybody in the whole empire an insider. We have no idea why he did it, but it's a big change.
Sounds huge. But yeah, thank you for coming in, Mary. Really interesting talk.
Thank you.
Should we say thank you to...
The Mishcon Academy Digital Sessions. To access advice for businesses that is regularly updated, please visit mishcon.com.